I'm standing on top of Mesa Verde in Colorado, and I've just come from a hike down into one of the cliff dwellings built by the ancient Pueblo. I thought it's inspired me to do a podcast, but my family's waiting on me, so I just want to record a brief message while I'm outside under the sky before I get back in the car. And then if I get a little bit of time later on this week, I'll finish out the episode I'm thinking about doing. Hi, I'm BJ, and this is the Arcane Alienist Podcast. So that was me last week, standing at an elevation of about 8,200 feet above sea level. The highest points on Mesa Verde are 8,500, so I wasn't at the highest place, but I was pretty close. Anyway, what that really inspired me to think about in terms of gaming is the role of ancient cultures and the ruins that they leave behind, the artifacts they leave behind, the legacies they leave behind, and what is known and unknown in a role-playing game setting. Of course, that's pretty much a staple of Dungeons and Dragons and other fantasy role-playings that you would find. Dungeons and ruins and abandoned castles from ages past. And I guess the real thing to think about is, do you flesh out as the world builder or as the game master? How much do you flesh out what the origins of those places are? You don't have to, obviously. It can just remain a mystery. Or are some things known and some things unknown? But it adds a lot, I think, to being able to ground yourself and your players in a setting when you have ancient cultures that pass on both history and legacy that people are aware of, but also things that are you can only be speculated on or can only be sort of deduced with a little bit of investigation and thought. And that's very true of the cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde. What we know about them is partially because those were Pueblo people. They're not a lost culture or civilization. The Pueblo people still live today. There are 21 distinct Native American groups that trace their ancestry to the cliff dwellers at Mesa Verde, and so there are things they know about their ancestors that there's no reason to question that they know these things. And there are the modern archaeological and anthropological studies of the sites that fill in some of the blanks and flesh out some of what is there, because we're talking about the time and place these existed, there's no written record. There's only the oral history, which I think oral histories are probably more reliable than a lot of times they're given credit for. But they are subject to change and revision and each telling sometimes. But we also have modern archaeology and scientific evidence that also tell us a little bit about why the ancient Pueblo began to live in cliff dwellings for the period that they lived there. And I thought that was really interesting. Just as an aside of what is known in a nutshell. I'd visited Mesa Verde about 20 years ago. My wife actually grew up in her early childhood at the foot of Mesa Verde in a little town in Colorado. And so I've been to the top several times. About 20 years ago, we actually took the time to go down and hike to one of the Cliff Palace, which is the most well-known from photographs, probably the most recognizable of the dwellings. And this time we went to a different one called the Longhouse Dwelling. But I learned a little more this time on the tour about kind of where the cliff dwellings come from and what we know about how they came to be and what happened. And the idea, what had happened was the ancient Pueblo lived on top of the mesa, and that was the only place ancient Pueblo people lived. They find other places they've built buildings, and as Pueblo, of course, the reason they're referred to as Pueblo is because they built houses and towns. They weren't nomadic; they were settled, but had a very distinctive style using the materials of the Southwest desert to do that. Google Pueblo, and you can see the Pueblo style dwellings, kind of square, flat roofed houses. But some of the ancient Pueblo lived on top of Mesa Verde. But then what seems to have happened is during a period of drought, they took to living in these recesses under cliff over the kind of overhangs of the cliff. I can't remember what they call that geological structure where it's not really fully a cave. It's just sort of a recess where you can climb down, and there's just a little recess back in the cliff face, and it's due to erosion because of the layers of sandstone and sediment from back when that entire part of North America was under an ocean, and then not under an ocean, and under an ocean again, and things happened on a geological time scale. But as a result, you have these spaces throughout Mesa Verde, just not too many feet below the top, that were suited to build small pueblos on. And they were well guarded, well protected from the elements. It was interesting to me. It was a fairly hot day when we hiked down, and just the noticeable difference of standing at the lip in the sun and then moving to the back of which was probably 25, 50 yards at the most, to the back of the structure. It's not a cave, I can't remember what you call it, but the difference in the coolness of it, of course, being a very dry climate, not the humid climate I'm used to in Oklahoma. Here, when you get in the shade, you don't have the sun beating down on you, but it's not much cooler because the humidity causes the heat to just be absorbed wherever you are outside. There, because it's so dry, once you're out of the sun, the temperature changes noticeably. And so it was protected from the elements, both the heat and then any kind of rain or wind. And they found a very unique way of living, of course, still farming on top of the mesa. So part of their life was still to have to climb up the side, a couple hundred feet to the top to do their farming and bring food down. But of course, they had rooms for storing food, and they had places for storing water and pottery, and ways of extracting water, within the water that seeps down through the sandstone into the thing. The reason I'm going into all this detail on my role-playing podcast is because those might be things you think about when you put structures or places where ancient civilizations have been. You might think about, well, with their time, their technology level, and their knowledge, how would they have lived? And of course, you can look to the real world for lots of examples of that. Of course, you can add magical and fantastic elements when you're talking about a role-playing game, or if you're playing a sci-fi game. Do they have ancient technology? Did they achieve a really advanced level of technology on whatever world or planet they're on before the people discover it, and then you effectively discover like ancient aliens or ancient non-human ruins. But they can be technically advanced when you're talking about a sci-fi game. At any rate, that was just really something that struck me as interesting to think about in terms of placing ruins, dungeons, ancient structures in your game setting. Is how much is it a mystery? How much is known? And then what is known, where does that come from? Does that come from the other people that are indigenous to that area? Say, oh yeah, our ancestors used to live over there, and this is why we moved away. It's a cliff dwelling. Well, we got to climb up and down the side of that cliff. That's not always safe. We're pretty good at it because it's our lifestyle. But hey, the drought ended, and now we have this lush valley below us that we can go. And it's a little better to live there. Or there's not much space there, and the clan, the tribe, the extended family started to get so big. We just needed to find a bigger space, and it became more efficient to move back to the top or move down into the valley below. But you would need to decide that in your setting. Again, I'm sort of using the ancient Pueblo as an example of some of the reasons they may have moved. but there would be, what do the people there know about these abandoned structures that are in the vicinity, and what's unknown to them, and what would you, as part of the campaign, what might the players discover exploring that may have been unknown before? Why might they be going there? Is it okay for them to be there? Is that seen as an affront to the locals, that you're picking around in this place, and you're those are our ancestral home, and even though nobody lives there anymore, you can't just go up there and start poking around. Or maybe they're fine with it. Maybe they want you to do that to help them solve a mystery, or maybe you're working on behalf of some other benefactor who's looking for artifacts. And then if you find the artifacts, are those yours, or do they belong to the people who, again, the descendants of the people who used to live there? And you can get into all kinds of interesting stories. And in fact, another thing that makes me think of, if you look across from Mesa Verde, out over the Montezuma Valley, you see a mountain that's called Ute Mountain, and it's a sacred place to one of the Ute tribes that lives there. And if you look at it from the right angle, these mountains, it does look like the silhouette of a person laying down asleep. And one of the stories is that this is a great leader of the Ute people that is asleep, and when the time is right, he's going to wake up and come to their aid. I believe I'm getting that story right. If it's wrong, I apologize. Anybody who knows more accurately, please let me know. But how might you incorporate that into local lore, local tradition? But part of the issue is that's a place that's pretty important, and it's on the Ute Mountain Reservation, and they don't want just anybody up there poking around because it's a sacred place to them. The modern Pueblo, I think, are okay with what goes on at the cliff dwellings because it's a national park, and the Park Service works very well to help preserve both the site's integrity, but also the cultural history of it, and they work with the Pueblo peoples to make sure that visitors are respectful and don't tear things up, but also that it's an educational. It's the only national park that's been designated for cultural preservation as opposed to environmental preservation. It's really kind of a cool thing there. I'm getting off on a tangent again, notes from my vacation. But thinking about those kinds of things, with what kind of relationship do the locals have with the ancient history of the place they live in? What kind of information, if there are newer people who have come in, what do they know and not know? How are they viewed by the locals? Did they overtake the locals and wipe them out? Did they just kind of move and cohabitate? Those are all things that are interesting to think about as you world build. And I've heard a lot of more than one kind of seasoned game master and other people who develop and design games talk about it's useful to have at least a couple of ancient cultures and kind of flesh them out in your own mind, even if you don't give all that information to the players. Those are mysteries to solve, but it kind of helps to know, okay, well, here was one civilization, and then it kind of evolved into something else, and here's what changed, and then what remnants are left of that in terms of ruins and artifacts. And then 1,000 years later, this other civilization kind of moved into the area, and was there conflict? Did they merge? Did they meld? Did they into one? Do they still live as distinct? Their descendants still lived as distinct cultures? How they influenced each other. Other things to think about when you're considering ancient time, ancient people, ancient ruins. Another interesting thing, years ago, when I first visited and heard information about the history of the natives of that part of North America, is the people who lived in the cliff dwellings and some of the other really old Pueblo sites were commonly referred to as the Anasazi. And that word comes from the Navajo language, and it literally means ancient enemy. And in the modern era, the Navajo don't use it kind of with that connotation. It just means ancient people. But the Pueblo have asked, please don't refer to our ancestors as ancient enemy. They're our ancestors. They're not ancient enemies. They're ancient Pueblo. We're still here. These are just our ancestors. And so the term is shifted to refer to them as the ancient Pueblo, more accurately depicting who they are. Interestingly enough, I just said Navajo, and I say that because that's probably where most of the people who hear this are going to recognize who I'm talking about. But even the Navajo is not the name they have for themselves. Their name for themselves in their language is Dene, D-I-N-E, Dene. And so, but think about that in your world. I mean, in the common tongue, where do the phrases or the names, the terms referred for places and people historically come from, and who sets the tone for what the common word to refer to different groups are, and is it something that group names themselves, or is it a group, the name someone else has given them? And then is it a name that they feel is accurate or inaccurate? And you can see that particularly if you study the history of indigenous Americans. A lot of times the common names we will use for different tribes and different Indian nations are words from another. It's not, somebody didn't come up and say, what do you guys call yourselves? It's a name they got from a neighboring tribe that may not have been very flattering or accurate, because there's a rivalry or a conflict between those tribes. These people are traditional enemies, and so the name we call them is pretty derogatory, but that's the one that works its way into French or English and becomes the predominant term we commonly to refer to that group. Does that happen among groups, and where do those ancient alliances and friendships and enmities come from that might influence things like that? Again, another way to kind of get in. 99% of the time, nobody probably cares when you're playing D&D or another role-playing game. But if you've got a group of players who really like to get into setting lore, or if it just helps you as a DM wrap your head around the setting you're running, so if someone happens to ask a random question, you have an idea of how to answer it, can be very helpful. Anyway, a couple of plugs. I had a really great trip. I spent about most of the time in Colorado, but got to spend a little time in New Mexico as well. I got to visit some really cool game stores. I spent a couple days in Santa Fe and got to visit my favorite game store in Santa Fe, and that is Moon Rabbit Toys, which is, they have toys, but they also have a lot of games. They in-house develop and play test games. You should check them out on the internet. It's a great store. And then in Durango, Colorado, another great one we got to visit was Guildhouse Games. Moon Rabbit doesn't have a lot of role-playing stuff, but they have a lot of cool board game stuff that would probably overlap with interests of role players. Guildhouse they had board games, and they had role-playing games and miniatures and paints. They had Warhammer, they had D&D, they had Pathfinder, but then they also had a lot of cool board games and other hobby stuff, puzzles and yo-yos. And so I got some dice, custom dice from there, some six-sided dice where the one is their logo, and then being in New Mexico at Moon Rabbit Games, I got some six-sided dice where the pips are all little alien faces. So, given the proximity to Roswell is also in New Mexico. I mean, Santa Fe and Roswell are not really that close to one another. They're almost on opposite ends of the state, north and south-wise, but a couple of really good game shops, and they both have presences on social media and on websites and Facebook places. I'll try to put a link in the show description for both of them. But yeah, had a good restful vacation. Got a lot of hiking in. I think I lost 5 pounds over the course of the week and a half just from all the walking and hiking we did. Hopefully I'll keep it off and not pack it all back on in the next 3 or 4 days now that I'm back at home with air conditioning and a more bountiful supply of food in the fridge than we had out there. Anyway, that's kind of my thoughts inspired by my vacation on ancient cultures and structures in your role-playing game. Let me know what you guys think. Always love to hear feedback, calls, questions, and other things that keep the conversation going. So now we'll turn to, I believe we've got some calls here from Rob from Down in a Heap and Joe Richter from Hindsightless.
Yo, BJ. So just listening to Carl's question for me on your latest episode about why me saying that Pathfinder 2 was the reason I was on Anchor, why that would make more people hate Pathfinder 2. I haven't listened to your response yet, but just to answer the question, it was a joke about how people on Anchor hate me and therefore hate the things that I associate with. That's what I was trying to say. And you know that old saying, when you have to explain a joke, you know it was a really, really good joke. Anyway, man, back to the show. Peace out. Yo, BJ, me again. So you just mentioned that video that Cody put out from Taking 20. And yeah, that video is absolute bullshit. Nothing, well, almost nothing he said in that video was accurate. A bunch of the stuff he said is just factually flat out wrong. Dude completely doesn't know how to play the game and is too stupid to figure it out, so just cried about it instead. That video pissed me off so bad because I really love Pathfinder 2. I'm just not playing it right now, but I do love it. And yeah, that video, I lost all respect for that dude. It was nonsense. It was garbage. And he got a ton of hate for it. If you look at the comments on that video, people are just like, dude, you clearly don't know what the fuck you're talking about, so maybe shut your mouth. Anyway, man, yeah, that video sucks. Peace out, dude.
Hey, Joe. Yeah, I kind of figured you were just joking about, people don't like you, so when you endorse Pathfinder, they're not going to like Pathfinder. That's not true. We all love you, Joe. Otherwise, we wouldn't let you leave messages, and we wouldn't call your show and wouldn't hang out with you. So we know when you're kidding around, when you're playing. As far as that Taking 20 video by Cody, I normally like Cody's stuff. He seems like generally a pretty okay guy. But yeah, I saw some of the comments on that video that he had kind of missed the point of Pathfinder. I haven't found it. I think he was talking about the illusion of choice, where there are optimal builds, and so players just kept building the same thing, and then when you build a character, you find that you have a couple of optimal choices even among the things you can do as your character is built, and people just spam that. And I think that's always been true. I don't think that's unique to Pathfinder 2e. I think that's been every version of Pathfinder, D&D, and most other role-playing games is, you try to be creative with your design, and the mechanics don't always bear out certain things. It was good on paper, but it doesn't work in practice, and people put it to the side and kind of gravitate towards a smaller set of the choices the game gives you. And players kind of hit a stride. They get a feel for their character, and they make choices about their equipment and their abilities, their feats. And even within those choices, they find the ones that tend to work best in most situations. And it's always one of those things where, people will claim a wizard is boring because they use the same couple of attack cantrips over and over again, but nobody claims that the fighter is boring when they use the same weapon over and over and over again. That's the signature weapon. Well, this is my signature offensive spell, and I have all these other, we all have other things we do outside of combat and other parts of the game, and hopefully, it's not just doing the same thing, one or two things over and over again for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours a session. So yeah, I agree. I think he was maybe trying to make a point there that maybe his players that he's playing with, just didn't quite grok Pathfinder 2e or didn't give it enough of a chance. But oh well, different folks have different tastes. What are you gonna do? But I think Joe's got a little more to say on another topic here. Let's see what we got.
Yeah, so I guess I should listen to all the episode before I start calling in. But anyway, man, BJ, I'm really glad you brought up the point about how when a dungeon master is looking for a backstory and there's a character that just isn't engaged enough, doesn't care enough to give any little bit of a backstory, how that can be just as big of an issue, though rarely talked about, so thank you for bringing it up. But a bigger issue to me than a character giving me a huge, intricate backstory about all their stuff. Especially if you're running like a homebrew sandboxy campaign and a character just comes in and like, oh, this is my character, I guess this is their name. Whatever, we'll figure it out as we go. Yeah, that pulls a lot of tools out of the Dungeon Master toolbox. So yeah, thank you for bringing that point up, man. Anyway, maybe I'll call in again. Who knows? Peace out.
Yeah, well, thanks for validating what I said there. And I'm okay with people kind of making their character backstory up as they go over the first few sessions, the first level or two. If they don't have, I want to say, well, you can't sit down at the table and play if you don't have this fleshed out. You hadn't had time to think about it, or you haven't, the inspiration hasn't really hit you yet. I'm okay with being a little flexible on that, but at some point, yeah, you need to have a sense of who your character is. It doesn't need to be overly complicated or extremely detailed. How I usually play that is if I don't have a huge idea, I just give them a boring backstory. It's like, yeah, there's nothing really much to tell. My guy was a farmhand, and he decided he wanted to be an adventurer, and all I really got to figure out is, well, how did he make that transition, depending on the setting. Was he, did he just walk off and quit his job, or did he have to do something to get himself out of his obligation to the local lord? Was if he was a lot more like a serf, but but those don't have to be big, exciting, detailed stories. Maybe he did a favor, to one day and for the Lord. And they're like, I'll grant you anything. He's like, I always want to be an adventurer. And he's like, well, I got plenty of serfs. Go ahead, seek your fortune, buddy. Who knows? But yeah, those just when they won't give you anything. And I think when you're running like a canned adventure where it really doesn't matter what the character's backstory is, because you're going to play this adventure and this is going to be the objective. You're going to be going after this MacGuffin and fighting this villain regardless of what. That's maybe not so important. But when you try to homebrew up a sandbox, it really responds to the players in terms of which players or characters are there and what they're doing and how they might be rooted in the setting, because that's going to flesh out what adventures are possible and what things may or may not happen. And they're just not giving you anything. It's like, well, I guess if a player is okay with that, if they're just more passive and along for the ride, and that's all it takes to make them happy, that's cool. But it does limit the things the Dungeon Master can do when it's a game where you're relying on player input and feedback and player decisions to decide what's going on in the background that'll open up different avenues of adventure. So anyway, thanks for the calls, Joe. Everybody be sure and check out Joe's podcast, Hindsightless. And I think this Friday on Cerebrivore, Joe is going to be joining us for an episode where we discuss not the best game systems, but how game systems are put into print form and presented for players and game masters, and what are the good and bad of how games are presented and how rules are laid out and things like that. So that episode will be dropping this coming Friday, and that'll include me and Joe, and I think Carl Rodriguez and Jason Carnley as well, the usual suspects. Anyway. Now we've got some calls from Rob.
Hey BJ, it's Rob from Down at a Heap. Just calling in regards to your episode July 1 on backgrounds. I listened to it when it first came out and then dragged my feet trying to make amends and actually calling about it. So I have had I don't know if you want to call it horror story, but the experience of a player handing me, I think it was maybe 6 or 7 pages of handwritten background for their character, and their character was some kind of like caretaker or even like librarian for Odin in this huge library / museum of artifacts, and his character was sent out in the world to recover more relics and artifacts and knowledge for the library. And I'm going to Jackson. So I didn't really... The thing is, he really expected me to fold this into the campaign. So his first level character was some kind of agent for Odin. And thankfully the campaign didn't last very long. But I was trying to kind of accommodate him, but at the same time I felt a little bit of resentment, like I do in a lot of cases with these involved backstories. Because here's the deal: if you're a player that needs to create a background for your character to really feel like you're playing the game, playing the character, that's cool, as long as you're not trying to shoehorn it in and make the other players and the DM really care about it and have the game revolve around it, because you're not the main character, you're one. So what I see sometimes with players that do these involved backstories, and especially where their character is some kind of chosen one or a orphaned prince or something, the the really difficult backstories, is that they're almost trying to write the campaign for the DM. or they're writing their part in the campaign, and this is kind of like their wish list or something that they hand the DM. Or with really bad players, it's almost like a list of demands. Now that's a big outlier. And for the most part, I think people that write backstories or backgrounds for their characters are fine. It's no problem. I do think, though, that it's best to leave wiggle room, both as a DM and a player. Leave blank spots so that you can react to what's going on in the game and fill in things and flesh things out as you go. But those are just my thoughts and my experiences. See ya. And I listened to your latest episode, and in response to Jason's call, you covered a lot of this, so don't feel obligated to play those earlier messages. I do kind of feel, though, that character background, can be, in some cases, baggage. For me, I feel more like it leans more towards baggage. Outside of just maybe a couple lines of what your character did or came from or whatever to flesh them out. But when you start writing pages of stuff for your background, again, if that helps you really get into the game and really want to play that character, totally cool. But for me, I end up dying a lot at first level, so it's kind of like, why did I bother? Let's just create something together at the table as it goes.
Hey Rob, I think you make some very good points. Too much. There can be too much. There can be too little. But yeah, a 6-page backstory, and you expect me to incorporate this. I think you're right. You're trying to, if it helps you understand your character and put you in a headspace where you can play your character better, that's great. If it becomes a way you've obligated, the DM and however two to 5 other people who are playing characters to have to know all this and keep up with this and be invested in and make their decisions based on it, that's maybe a little presumptuous. Unless everybody's agreed kind of, we're going to sit down and this is the kind of campaign we're going to run. Everybody make a big detailed backstory and we're going to weave them together, which could be fun. But I think you need to talk to the DM and the other players and kind of read the room and get a sense of the campaign before you pull the trigger on doing that. Because it can be, particularly when you start to, you don't ask, well, what are we playing in? What's the campaign like? What kind of characters exist in this game world? You're kind of making the DM insert elements to the campaign setting that may not have otherwise been there and that may not fit with other things that are going on. I think I mentioned before the idea that I've heard Jim Davis of WebDM say is that way back when, now we're sounding like old grognards, aren't we? The DM presented a world and players built a character to play the world. The character was built for the world or the campaign or the scenario the DM was presenting. Now people sometimes treat character creation as an exercise in personal expression and creativity, almost with the expectation that then the DM is going to look and then adjust the campaign around the characters that come to the table. And that's fine too. I've done that. I don't mind doing that necessarily, but I think it works better when everybody sits down and kind of has that discussion of, here's kind of what we're going to do. These are the kind of characters that are going to fit well, kind of stick within those parameters, so that, I'm not spending 10 to 15 minute chunks of time during campaign trying to figure out wait a minute, how are the people in the village going to react to this character who doesn't really fit, and it seems like it's really fun to have an interesting character until you're constantly harangued, harassed, and gawked at by, all the NPCs because, you're a spectacle because you built a character that doesn't fit the campaign world. Anyway, I appreciate the calls, Rob. Always good to hear from you, everybody. That's Rob from Down in a Heap. Also, one of a great podcast here on Anchor. He's been taking a hiatus, but now he's back. He's put out quite a few episodes in the last few weeks, so be sure and check out his podcast as well. And now to think of it a little more, when I was in graduate school, I was learning to write the kind of reports I have to write in my profession. These lengthy, and you kind of, by design, I think when you're teaching someone to do something, you want them to be thorough and methodical and very, you learn to do it this way, and as you gain more experience and wisdom, you can kind of tweak it for yourself. But let's start with the complete standard. So these very lengthy reports that I would write. Then I got to internship, and the person who supervised me was like, these reports are too long. These reports are not for you. These reports are for other people to read. They're to inform other people on decisions they're going to be making about the people you're evaluating. You need to target them to your audience and just put what they need to know, or what you think they need to know. And the reports got a little shorter and a little shorter and a little shorter. So now 20 years later, my reports are pretty not as long as most other psychologists. Because of that, I think about who's going to be primarily be using this and what do I need them to know. And there's lots of other things I could report, but is it really relevant to the question at hand? And if it is, sometimes I still wind up with a very long report, but a lot of times they're more short and concise than they would have been otherwise. What am I getting at here? I think I'm getting at the same idea with your character backstory. If your character backstory is for you, so you remember who your character is and where they come from as a role-playing tool, have at it. If your character backstory is going to be for the DM and or other players to look at and know about, it needs to be in a digestible, just give them what they need to know. Don't overcomplicate it. And know that that's what it's for. And I think with D&D, because it is somewhat of a group storytelling exercise where everybody's playing a part and everybody's contributing something, the other players are kind of your audience, if that makes sense. And you should always play in a way that is engaging and inclusive and entertaining of the other players. And when you're presenting this huge 6-page backstory, you're forcing everybody else to do the same thing. I don't know if you are, but you may be inadvertently forcing other people to feel like they need to do that just to keep up and have their share of the spotlight and their share of influence over how the campaign goes and what's happening. And so, whether you mean to or not, you don't want to be showboating or stealing the spotlight. That is to say that how you play your character and how you describe your character and the kind of backstory you might give your character, keep in mind that that's part of a group exercise and group storytelling and a group activity, and it needs to be matched to kind of what everybody else is doing. I hope that made sense. Sometimes I'll say things, they sound great in my head, I'll get them out in words, and I know what I'm trying to say, but I'm not sure I've actually said them in a way that's effective. So, anyway, shorter and more precise is always better. A topic I will return to again in this Friday's Cerebrivore when we talk about published games and how they're sort of put together, organized, and laid out on the page. So I will get out of here now. I think that's the end of the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you to Rob of Down in the Heat podcast and Joe Richter of Hide Sightless for their calls. And most importantly, thank everybody out there for listening, wherever you are. Take care of yourselves, and I'll be back with another episode in the future. Thanks for listening to the Arcane Alienist podcast. The music you're hearing is Come and Get It by Scott Holmes Music. The cover art I use for the episodes is by Dave Bone. Be sure and check out his website, ironseer.com, for a lot of other great gaming-related content. You can always leave me a voice message through the Anchor app or at the Anchor website, or you can email me at arcane.alienist@gmail.com. Once again, I appreciate you listening. Thanks so much.